Hello and welcome. The last US combat brigade has left Iraq, but who should be held accountable for the invasion and occupation that has left a death toll in the hundreds of thousands? The country has been in a political stalemate since its parliamentary elections in March, with the US pushing for a coalition government. With no deal in place and no outright winner, the top leading figures, Nouri al-Maliki and Ayad Alawi, have been left to sort it out. In the meantime, regional powers such as Iran, Syria and Turkey are all trying to influence the outcome. Critics of the war and occupation say that Iraq is worse off than it was under Saddam Hussein, and that those who led the charge for war should be held accountable and possibly charged with war crimes. On today's show, we look at the situation there and ask who should be held accountable for the war in Iraq. Remember, you can submit your questions and comments by calling onto the show or just sending us a message via SMS or email. Well, my guest today is the renowned journalist John Pilger, who's covered some of history's biggest stories around the world in a career spanning more than half a century. He's made some 60 documentary films and has twice been honoured as Britain's Journalist of the Year. Mr. Pilger is also critical of the war and occupation in Afghanistan and how the Western media has gotten the story wrong over the years. Well, his latest film, The War You Don't See, is due to be released in autumn. John Pilger joins us from London. Mr. Pilger, good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Good to be on the show.
Sir, the US, of course, now is claiming its end of combat missions in Iraq and troops are being reduced by 40%, but there doesn't seem to be a real clarity about what's going on and the definition of combat troops as opposed to any other presence there. How do you regard this pullout as it's being reported?
Well, I think there is clarity. The clarity is there is no pullout. You know, the Pentagon has spent something like $4.5 billion over the last 5 years on spin, media operations. And this is a pretty good example. There is no pullout. There is something called rebranding. Combat operations have become stability operations. And when you have Major General Stephen Lanzo, the spokesman in Baghdad, saying, as he said the other day, in effect nothing has changed, you get an idea. There'll be 50,000 troops in 94 bases. There'll be 100,000 so-called contractors, mercenaries, and they will be increased. The US has no intention whatsoever in leaving Iraq and pulling its military out. Its military isn't being pulled out. It's just, it's what the CIA used to call master illusion.
It's interesting how you described it as rebranding, and I was thinking that to play devil's advocate, isn't there an argument for the presence to remain till there is a more stable Iraq, considering it hasn't had a functioning government for so long, well, certainly since the election, 5 months or so? Isn't there a need for a presence until things stabilize?
Wait on. There's hang on. The assumption in that the Americans invaded the country, right, and then occupied it, invaded it illegally, and then occupied it. They triggered a most terrible situation in that country, in which, according to scholarly estimates, about 1 million people have been killed, 4 million people have fled their homes. Iraq needs to be handed back to the Iraqis, and they can sort out who they want governing them. And, at that level, it's quite simple. It's not simple when you then enter into the politics of it, but the Americans are a foreign invader. They shouldn't be there, but that's they're going to be there because 60% of one of the reasons, 60% of Iran's oil has been contracted to foreign major oil companies. A lot of those contracts are rather dodgy. So the Americans have got to really hang around to ensure that they are that goes ahead. But that's not the only reason. Iraq is the return of Iraq, if you like, is an essential pillar in American foreign designs in the Middle East. The original 4 pillars were Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Iran was, quote, lost. Iraq was lost briefly, and now they've got it back. That's the reason they invaded the country. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a sort of government there, but it's government that sits inside a fortress called the Green Zone, and it wouldn't last a minute if the Americans were genuinely pulling out. So I really think we should not assume that what the Pentagon tells us in any sense is true.
I'm going to ask you more about the way the media covers this a little later in the program, but let me ask you one thing. Now, the reports of American soldiers that were withdrawing, shouting, "We've won," as they've left, which I know caused a lot of ire among a lot of Iraqis. I wonder, I know you see that the Iraqis are the losers in this whole equation. What do you expect will happen to Iraqis now, especially considering the sectarian divisions have been so highlighted in the post-Saddam era?
Those Americans shouting, "We've won," I don't think are representative. American soldiers actually have suffered nowhere near as much as the Iraqi people have suffered, but they too have suffered, and they just want to, I'm sure, get out. What will happen from here on? I think the US actually will consolidate its position in Iraq in the same way that it intends to do so and is doing so in Afghanistan, with a series of fortress bases. There are 94 bases at the moment. There are probably about 20 massive fortress-like bases. The Green Zone, so-called embassy, is about 20 times bigger than Vatican City. This is the US design for these countries, both Iraq and Afghanistan, that it doesn't occupy every inch of the country and have a writ running through various levels of government. It leaves that to a puppet government, but it will control it from bases. That's the future in that country. Okay. So for Americans to talk about "we won" is absurd, especially with so much.
Well, so I was going to say, we've got a caller on the line from Virginia. Oliver's joining us with a question for you. Oliver, go ahead.
Thank you, Riz. My question to the gentleman is why he's blaming the Americans, because in 2003, Britain was part of the invasion, and the British government was supporting the invasion, and also most of the Iraqi politicians now who's in charge of Iraq, they carry British passports. In addition, most of the security companies, a huge percentage of the security operatives over there, part of the security companies, they are former members of the SAS, British Special Forces. So I don't understand why he's blaming Americans and American invasion.
So Mr. Pilger, it's a case of, I guess, spreading the blame a bit here and perhaps holding Britain responsible, which I know you do, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. But your response to Oliver? Well,
I'm not quite sure what the caller's point was. America and Britain are the same in Iraq. America's just bigger. He's right. Many of the mercenaries are former British soldiers. And it's interesting, a lot of those oil contracts I mentioned revert much of Iraqi oil back to when it was controlled by the British before 1958. Yes, the British are equally to blame for what has happened in Iraq, and indeed probably about a quarter of the British population think that the former Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, should be prosecuted for war crimes.
It's interesting, talking about the point which has got us to where we are in Iraq now. In one of your recent columns, your most recent column published in the New Statesman magazine, you're very critical, of course, of Mr. Blair, as you've just mentioned, saying he should be prosecuted. Now, you write about him, Blair conspired in and executed an unprovoked war of aggression against a defenseless country of a kind the Nuremberg judges in 1946 described as paramount war crime. And this has caused, according to scholarly studies, the deaths of more than 1 million people. Now, we had lots of viewers sending questions on this issue, and if I could put two of them just back to back to you on the same theme, sir. First one from Camille Issa, who wrote in saying, "Are Americans above the law? Can't they be punished for their crimes in Iraq? What is the UN doing about this?" And the second from Somalia, from Noor Abdi Ali, says, "How capable is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in implementing a trial for Blair and Bush?" Now, what makes you believe that there may be any possibility any of these leaders might ever be held accountable, particularly Tony Blair?
Well, I don't, is the answer to that, in the short term. And those are good questions. The why are Americans above the law? Why do they have an impunity? Because of their power. That's all. There's no. They are the biggest and most powerful, and they can do as they wish in many circumstances because they are powerful. Mm-hmm. What are the UN doing about it? Well, the UN is effectively servile to American and great power interests. Not the General Assembly, but the great anachronism of that body, the Security Council, is. So, in the short term, no. It was wishful thinking to think that a Western leader would be prosecuted.
Well, you know, we had an email, again on this theme, from a viewer by the name of Pavel Kazimierz Otrebsky, who wrote in saying, George W. Bush and Tony Blair are both war criminals according to the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter. Now, of course, I guess conventions and charters don't seem to have much weight nowadays, and you were describing your view on how where the power structure lies. But to what degree was Tony Blair at fault for being too keen to please George W. Bush, to try to highlight this so-called special relationship that the US and the UK have?
I think he was as keen as Bush. I've never understood the view that he merely went along with Bush. There's no doubt that he wished to ingratiate himself. He's done that continuously in the United States. But I think he was as keen about it. He was able to articulate a sort of messianic view that, you know, we should be crusaders and right the wrongs of the Saddam regime and bring democracy to all that was nonsense, of course. So I think Blair was fixated with his own idea of in the world. You have to understand that in Britain, the British elite has never really got over losing its empire, and it draws great comfort from some imagined position as number two, and that's why it provides support and comfort for much of America's rapacious foreign policy. Right. So occasionally up comes a Blair who overdoes it. He shows his enthusiasm for restoring the empire rather too keenly. Okay,
well, I'm going to get some more questions to you, Mr. Pilger. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, more on where the media spin on war coverage may be keeping the public in the dark. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Does the public have a real grasp on war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or has the media failed to do its job? And who should be held accountable for advocating wars which some consider illegal? Now, my guest is the award-winning investigative journalist John Pilger, whose hard-hitting reporting has put him at the center of historic events. His latest project is a film on how the media spins the coverage of war. And before I get onto the media issues, Mr. Pilger, we've got a couple of callers I want to get in. We've got from Iraqi Kurdistan, we have Barzini on the phone. Please put your question to us.
Yes, hi, Mr. Riz and your guest. My question is, the majority, we had a referendum held throughout Kurdistan. 99% of the public, they voted in favor of independence. We still have problem with the central government. The issue of Kirkuk and the disputed areas, which is the Article 140 of the permanent Iraqi constitution, it has not been honored yet. On behalf of our Arab coalition partners, and we believe we've been the U.S. is inflicting everything on us.
Mr. Barzani, do you have a question?
Yes, sir. Why do not we? What is his opinion about partitioning Iraq?
Okay.
You know, the Vice President wants.
Okay. Let's ask Mr. Pilger to answer that. The idea of a partitioned Iraq, sir.
Look, first may I say, there's no people in the world who have been as betrayed as much as the Kurdish people, and they've been betrayed by great power, certainly right through my lifetime. They become very useful when the West chooses, or Western peoples choose to express some humanitarian concern for the region. Then the Kurds are suddenly popular. And we have in great power terms, we have you know, Kurds who are labeled good in Iraq and Kurds who are labeled bad in Turkey because they happen to be opposing a government that is a member of NATO. I think if ever there was a restored, rejuvenated United Nations, one of the first things it should do is address the struggle of the Kurdish people. Whether that means the partition of Iraq, I don't know, personally. I think a Kurdistan certainly has a right to independence. Okay. And the borders of that Kurdistan certainly need to be worked out.
Amir in Canada has a question too. Amir, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My question is this problem in Iraq especially started with the British colonized policies in the 19th and late 20th century. Now, if American left and Iraq, like you said, chooses its own government, the Iraqi people chooses its own government, there usually is a power vacuum. Who will fill up this power vacuum? History has shown usually Europeans take over this power vacuum.
Okay.
And I'd like to know your opinion on this.
Thank you, Amir.
Thank you.
Well, you're right. The outsiders usually step into the power vacuum. But I think nothing really can change in Iraq. Iraq will never be independent. No country can ever be independent while it is occupied by foreigners. That's a given. That's a truism. And for the wounds to be healed, for deals to be done, for negotiations to be succeed, the foreigners have to leave. Otherwise, there is a permanent affliction, a permanent canker in that society. No matter how independent it might seem, it isn't.
Okay, I've got a caller on. Sorry, I've got a question about your new documentary that's coming out, sir, "The War You Don't See," which is coming out soon. Now, what prompted you to focus on media spin? What was it that really made you want to highlight the way the story isn't told, in your opinion?
Well, I've been a journalist for some time, and I've been writing about my own occupation, and I think what has interestingly happened in the last 15, 20 years even, that public awareness of the role of the media in being an extension of government, being an extension of great power in democratic societies. I think all the great media mythology of objectivity and impartiality is no longer accepted by the wider public, who can see what, for example, embedded reporting does in wartime in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. But of course this has a history. It goes way back to First World War at the beginning of the 20th century, when the first thing governments did was co-opt the media, co-opt journalists. Nothing has really changed, and I've reported a number of wars, and I've observed this, and I think the media play a very, very important role in, let's say, the drumbeat of war, in preparing or attempting to prepare democratic societies for unpopular war,
right.
for giving them the sort of...
sorry, sir, I was going to ask you, I wonder if you see the same, the comparison works for Britain and America in the same way. I mean, you know, there was the recent case of Helen Thomas, the veteran White House correspondent, making one comment, and of course it was the end of her career. I wonder if you see it more the case in America than in Britain right now.
Yes, I think it is more extreme in America.
And
the organization Fair and Accuracy in Media, which is very, very good in monitoring the media in America, estimate that up to 80% of sources in the mainstream press, the mainstream media, radio, are government or are government related. That's not a free press, that's not a free media. That's very easy then to have spun news, not real news. Something similar exists in Britain. It's not as extreme.
I wonder, we've been talking about Iraq, whether, just a quick thought with just a minute and a half to go, whether, we could be having the same discussion with Afghanistan, the other front that the US is focused on, pretty much in the same way, and that there's no accountability and media coverage sways backwards and forwards on focusing on this issue.
Yeah. Look, the words that are missing are colonial wars. It really is an insult to our historical intelligence. Both Iraq and Afghanistan are classic colonial wars. The same old euphemisms of restoring democracy or finding non-existent weapons of mass destruction and defeating the Taliban and so on. They are colonial wars. They're colonial wars because they're both important, strategically important and resource important countries. Afghanistan not directly, but historically it is. And it's the true irony that British soldiers march past the graves of their forebears in the 19th century. The Soviets were there for 10 years, right. And they couldn't subdue the country. So you never underestimate the militaries of countries to go and make a mess of something all over again. That's what they're doing. Well,
John Pilger, it was a real pleasure to talk with you, sir. I'm glad you spent the time with us discussing these issues. Hope to speak with you again.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Now remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can submit questions for our guests and see what viewers from around the world have to say about the shows. On the next Riz Khan program, the legacy of occupation. How will Iraq deal with its shattered economy, sectarian divisions and political uncertainty as the US winds down its military presence after 7 tumultuous years? Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.